Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Ransomware, Prepare, Respond, Recover. I'm Abby Lundberg, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Ransomware attacks increased by 150% from 2019 to 2020, according to InfoSecurity magazine. Hospitals, manufacturing companies, and government entities have been particularly hard hit, while utilities and transportation companies saw the biggest jumps. The Colonial Pipeline attack was big news in the United States this spring. And just this month, a coordinated attack targeted hundreds of businesses around the world, from the grocery chain in Sweden to a New Zealand school system. The bottom line is that no organization, large or small, for-profit or not, is safe from ransomware. Business leaders ignore the danger at their peril. In today's webinar, Lucas Bobroff from Pure Storage will explain this growing global threat and discuss what businesses should do about it now. You'll learn what ransomware is and how it works, how to prepare for and respond to a ransomware threat, and how to recover quickly when prevention fails. Lucas Bobroff is Staff Data Architect at Pure Storage. He helps customers modernize their storage and backup environments and take advantage of best-in-breed technology. These days, he spends a lot of his time answering customers' questions about ransomware and how to deal with it. In addition to his storage and backup expertise, he has hands-on technology experience in other domains, including virtualization and networking. Welcome, Lucas.
Thank you, Abby. And with that, I will get into what I'm going to go over today for everyone. So as Abby kind of alluded, ransomware is now a national security issue in a lot of ways. There are a lot of challenges that countries are having with this. You'll see what China has started to do in reference to banning Bitcoin to start to combat a lot of things that are being attacked by ransomware. And the primary payment source that we've all seen in the industry these days has been Bitcoin because of the simplicity of delivering that for payment, because it's completely anonymous. And there's a lot of organizations that have to start to deal with that. And there's a lot of challenges that are in this arena that ransomware has now been causing for customers, because no country's immune, and every country has been facing different issues for this. So with that, we're going to get actually into a first poll question.
How would you recover from a ransomware attack? And please select all that apply. Would you pay the ransom, start over from scratch, recover your backups from tape, recover your backups from disk, recover your backups from the cloud? And just take a minute or two to answer that.
So it seems as if most of you have a recovery method from recovering from the cloud, which is typical these days. There's a lot of solutions out there, and depending on how your actual environment may be, you may be 100% cloud deployed, but there's a lot of solutions that deliver a cloud out feature functionality that customers will recover from. Depending on your size of your organization, some customers have backups in your environment itself. Some customers rely 100% on cloud backups depending on the size of the organization, and no customer is different in this situation. There's a lot of different mechanisms to recover your environment, and the challenge that comes into play is which one is the best method to do that in a timely manner, because that's what you're trying to deliver, is a timely SLA for recovery. So when you look at how different industries are getting hit, every industry is being attacked, unfortunately. I mean, no specific region of the world is not being attacked. I mean, yeah, China has the Great Firewall of China, so they do have some restrictions on trying to get in some cases, but there's still bad attackers inside the country itself, which may be impacting how they are actually being hit. And you'll see here on the slide, I mean, there's a lot of different style organizations. We have Baltimore County Public Schools, which is an organization that is just a public school segment in the United States itself. Then you also have healthcare organizations that have had their information exposed on their customers, aka consumers that have gone to the hospital, that are exposed, and they're on the dark web in most cases. Their information, personal information, is now something that people can pay for on the dark web. And then at that point, your information is now exposed, that you could be getting credit card alerts, all those types of things that you thought going to a organization that protects your well-being due to the standards that they're a part of, Unfortunately, they're not capable of doing that in a lot of ways because their information is not protected in a very simplistic way. And there's a lot of environments that are being hit. I mean, there's a London foreign exchange currency that was crippled where they were offline for weeks. And you're hearing stories of this every single day. If you were to go to an online source just to search for ransomware, you'll probably see an article within the last week for an organization that was hit that's recovering from ransomware. And the challenge really comes into play of there's no easy way to get out of it. And it takes time to get back online. And that's not easy for a lot of organizations to get back online. And to dive a little bit more into it, no organization's immune. I mean, in the last 10 months, over 140 local governments, so that's in the United States, police stations, hospitals, were held ransom for potential days on weeks from an attacker that was going into their environment. And then you also have a specific New Jersey school district that the payroll was down after their ransomware attack, so people could not put in their pay time, and they were actually out of, they could not deliver their paychecks to their end employees themselves. Then you have Spanish companies where their networks were completely shut down because they were not capable of defending themselves against ransomware. And then other ones, I mean, hackers demand $5 million in ransom from a Mexico company. And then one last one where an actual online hosting organization, so it could be cloud-esque from an overall customer perspective, they were having to recover from ransomware. And the challenge that you start to face when you look at a lot of these organizations that you do business with, potentially, whether they're in technology, whether they're a business-to-business relationship, if you have a design with information sharing, your information could be leaked by way of something that they're doing themselves. Unfortunately, that's the world we're in. You have to protect your well-being as an organization because you want to keep your name out of the limelight in most cases. And this is how you can start to potentially look at it. I mean, no organization really is immune. It takes about 21 days for ransomware. The average time is 21 days of downtime, which is not a long time frame. But if you were to ever think about it in the realm of, if I have 21 days that my workers in my employer were not working due to technology issues, what is the lost productivity dollar amount behind that? And then additionally, average days it takes for you to fully recover is really long. I mean, 287 days is insurmountable. That's almost a full year in a lot of ways, because you're trying to really think, all right, well, did I clean that environment? Did I make sure this environment was up and running perfectly? And then in most cases, the victims in 2020 paid an increase of 311% over the year prior just in ransomware payouts, which is huge from a payout perspective. And then the average payment increased drastically. And I'll go into why that increased drastically, because there's a lot of things that customers are starting to do in this realm to protect themselves in the aspect that they actually are impacted. And in 2020, nearly 2,400 US government, healthcare, schools were victims of ransomware itself. And this could be a very small town. This could be a very large school district. This could be a very large healthcare organization. There's a lot of ones that have been publicized online just due to the fact that they had to release the information. I mean, years ago, we were all well aware of people that were attacked. I mean, the bigger ones were the credit card agencies that had issues, or Experian that had an issue. They all were impacted, and they all have to do certain things from an organization perspective. When you look at how all these organizations come out of it, they don't have the freedom to deliver free credit checks for 2 years by way of their legal troubles that they've been dealing with. So there's a lot of things that you as an organization have to think about as you start to modernize and as you start to look at your environment itself to make sure you protect your front end, whether that's from a firewall or whatever mechanism, and then as well as your recovery mechanism to bring your environment back online. And most of you responded that you would recover from the cloud. So if you have a network issue, you're having trouble recovering from the cloud in most cases. So it's a lot of things like that that you have to consider when you look to modernize your environment itself. And the big thing that started to come out nowadays is ransomware insurance is a hot ticket item. As most organizations look to provide themselves a mechanism to pay the ransom if needed, Unfortunately, when you look at the rise of ransom payment costs, so as I said, 300,000 in the slide before, it's twofold what's causing this. There is an assumption from the attackers that there is a fund of sorts, aka insurance, that the customer has, and in some cases, the attackers end up finding the policy that the organization has for this. If the organization tries to play hardball in negotiations with the attackers will generally provide the policy back to the organization and say, this is what we want because you have a policy that states this is how much you have. There are some things to think about when looking at these types of insurance, and the descriptions are ever changing usually. When you may find out that the policy you bought your organization was voided because you did not have the appropriate measures to stop the attackers. Some policies require you to show this ahead of time and be insured, to even be insured, while some require you to show it after the attack to claim payment. This can range from end security devices all the way to backup solutions and the capabilities used to protect them. And here's an example in the real world of a ransomware attack, and this is at a train station in Europe. And what's crazy is this is an end machine that no one would have access to. It's running an application for the train station. There is no way that you would have access to this from an end user perspective. But there's a lot of other examples that are part of this that you could even see in the real world that you may all have seen yourselves, but it's very real and it impacts everyday life. You were to think, hey, I can go to a hospital and I can actually get a procedure done. Well, if they're all offline from a technology perspective, they may have trouble delivering your surgery because they don't have access to your records to know what you may have from an issue perspective. And that's a huge issue as you start to think, well, that really could impact me and my loved ones that I would never have thought of before. And here's an example ransomware screen where these come in different shapes and forms, but the primary thing that a lot of customers have to think about is the payment is Bitcoin. It's because it's 100% anonymous. And there's even a "we're sorry" on it, which, I mean, are ransomware attackers really sorry? Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. And it's a common thing that you'll see in most cases. And where if you don't pay it, there's now an increase in cost. And that allows them to drive the sense of urgency to make you have a rash decision in the case of, hey, maybe I actually have to pay it in this time frame just to get my data back. And in some cases, you may not be able to get the full encryption key. They may only give you partial data back. And the challenge also that you now face with ransomware, if they've exfiltrated data from your environment, you now have to confirm, you now have to make sure that that information, whether it is confidential information about your customers, your employees, your intellectual property, is not leaked on the dark web. And that is a really big challenge for customers to face, where you don't know what they may or may not have because you can't trust what they're stating to you. That's the big world that we're in nowadays, that it's a very low trust factor in reference to ransomware attackers. And the anatomy of attack, if you don't know, in most cases when a customer is attacked, the attacker has not been in there for a limited amount of time. Although it does depend on the attack vector, and it does depend on the attack mechanism. Generally speaking, they find out a lot of information in this 50 to 200 plus days about the environment from their entry point. And then they're trying to see what that machine or application has access to. They're trying to see what permissions this user that they were able to gain access through has access to. And they're trying to target different things in the environment. They're trying to find out, all right, is this an IT person? Is this an end user that maybe doesn't have access to everything in the environment? What can I then get access to? Who can I then send something to have them open to expand my attack vector? And you'll find that they will eventually get to a point in the environment, still all undetected in most cases, to where they start to find production storage. And production storage, in some cases, could be the cloud, it could be internal to the data center. And the challenge that you start to face is, well, if that person has access to do these things, then they have access to potentially remove things off my environment. And when they start to say, all right, I found production storage, and then I have then found if they are doing backups or not, and where the backups are being stored. They will try and inflict as much pain as possible to the customer before they start to do the encryption. So before the data gets encrypted, they are going to try and figure out what they can do to inflict the most pain to your organization. And that, generally speaking, is getting rid of backups, getting rid of production storage, and that allows them to have the most painful situation for you to have you pay the ransom. If you look at when the data gets encrypted, well, they break the backups, they erase the snapshots that you may have in your environment. Then on the next day, they start to ask for the ransom. All right, well, that ransom starts small in some cases, or it starts very large and you start to negotiate it down. And then soon thereafter, you start to patch systems, begin your recovery, and your recovery point objective could be days, if not weeks. I mean, you saw the example, 21 days of average downtime. So that's from the data being encrypted all the way to the soon thereafter recovery point objective. That is a very long time frame for a customer. And if you look at the full picture, you have a limited amount of time before the data gets encrypted, and the data does get encrypted in some cases because they will then try and say, well, I may be getting found out. There may be a patch that hits the environment, and then they will start to inflict their pain. Generally, how customers have their most attacks happen, there's email phishing attacks. I mean, we all get them in our personal emails these days, and we all ignore them because we all know they're spam. But not every end user in your organization is smart enough, unfortunately, to figure out that that is a fake email. And there's a lot of technology out there to try and spam filter, but they're only as good as what version they are up to date with, how their mechanisms are being delivered, and everything's changing every single day on how these attackers are trying to get into your environment. And then again, there's brute force attacks that are also trying to get into remote desktop environments that are the most common ways that cyber criminals are using to gain initial access to a customer's environment to lay the foundations that you can see here as they start to progress in the environment itself. When you look at classic defense recommendations, defense in depth is what a lot of customers should be going towards. So education being the primary. I mean, you want to educate your employees to not click those types of links or go to unknown web pages on company machines. I mean, that's a common thing. I mean, we're all human. We all make mistakes. There's no way to protect us in some situations with a technology. Then you have those technologies, antivirus that protects your machine, patching, filtering from a webmail perspective, also filtering from a firewall world. These all are well and good. They're all technologies. That's something that you try and stop something from a technical perspective. Now, there's the fear that the product you're buying into could also be impacted. And we've seen this with some of these security organizations, as well as other organizations that are out there. Like SolarWinds was impacted. They were found out to have a loophole to get into a customer's organization at the tail end of 2020. And the challenge came into being, well, you're buying into technology, you have a trust factor with your vendor. And if they don't have their software up to snuff to protect against attackers, then you have another attack vector that someone can come in through that you never would have thought would have been possible. And then you have this financial investment that you're trying to do. It's a huge investment in some cases, where a lot of CFOs at an organization or financial people, the finance organization, have a tough pill to swallow when they look at how much this technology sometimes costs an organization, where you have to start to convince them, if we have a long time frame, if you were to look at 21 days of downtime, what is the value and lost productivity for our organizations, for our applications? A good example is if I have lost productivity for my end users, and those end users could be internal, they could be external to the organization, where if they're using the platform, a good example is Garmin, they were hit last year. If they are using the platform for their own personal use, if they don't have access to their tooling that they want to do, like a Garmin watch, that limits them in what they can do, and they may start to look at another solution if it takes you days to get back online. And then the last line of defense is data protection. I mean, if you're trying to bring your environment back online, that's where you will resolve your environment. That's where you will recover your environment. but you also have to have a solid backup solution to deliver this. And not every environment is backed up. Not every environment has a robust solution to deliver this. And they're the last line of defense for your environment. If your data gets encrypted, you have to restore from your backups, or you have to recover from DR, but you don't know if that disaster recovery copy is clean. So your best benefit is to recover from backup. And you can either pay it if you want to, but in most cases it's the pay and pray, where you don't know if they're going to actually give you back everything that you need to bring the environment back online. They may tease you, and they may give you only partial of the environment back. And when you look at where hackers are, they spend about 200 days, as I referenced before, in that anatomy of attack. And they're trying to find lots of different things in your environment. No backup, no recovery. That's what they want in their attack vector, what they're trying to deliver. And when they try and encrypt anything, they're trying to do a lot of testing. They're trying to see what access this user has, what access that user has. If I go ahead a slide, this environment is just a actual attack chain. Well, they got in through a bot before, which came in through an email. Someone accessed it. They were able to go in through a remote desktop. They had credential theft, and then they were able to start to say, all right, well, I stole that credential. What access do they have in the domain? What do they have access to in the rest of the environment itself? And when you look at credentials in an environment, multi-factor authentication comes to mind in most cases, where a lot of organizations start to have to deliver. And that's a great front-end security method for a lot of organizations to deliver. That does not stop you, unfortunately, from a full-on protection mechanism. It does not bring your environment back online. It only protects your environment from a front end. And when you look at how do I get to protect my backups, well, I need to have a good solution that is immutable by nature. I need to have a solution that does not have a long time of recovery to get my environment back online, because in some cases we live in a world of instantaneous response. You all pull up your phones, you all pull up a web page, that web page responds within about a second. And the challenge with that is we're not the only users that think that way nowadays. Our end users, our end consumers all have that same concept. They're all pre-programmed mentally to think about how they start to use these solutions in their environment. And those solutions could be just part of the portal that they're using, or even some things that they're using internal to the organization. And if any of that goes slower, you will hear complaints from an IT perspective. You more than likely already hear complaints on some things being slow. And if you start to say, well, it's going to take us 3 days to bring back this specific workflow application style to the environment, that's sometimes not going to fly with a lot of C-suite employees at an organization. And when you look at after an attack, you need two things organizationally. You need to have something that has valid, usable data copies. So that's generally speaking a backup solution, because hopefully you have an immutable backup solution. But then you also need something that's fast and scalable from a recovery perspective. And in most cases, when you look at a lot of backup platforms that are out there, they have a scale up model where you buy a certain solution and you just keep throwing in storage behind it. It does not speed up your recovery scenario to deliver that. A lot of backup solutions ingest data really, really well. They store your backups down in a very cost-effective manner. But if you were to ever ask them to recover a large scale environment, call it 20 terabytes or even more from that specific hardware, your recovery speed potentially will struggle. And we've seen this time and time again from our customers worldwide on how they generally face this issue. And I'm going to go into another poll question on how are you in your environment? And Abby, I'll have you.
Sure. So for this question, how confident or concerned are you about your organization's ability to recover from a ransomware attack? And in this case, just select one. Are you extremely confident that you can recover from a ransomware attack? Somewhat confident, neither confident or concerned, somewhat concerned, or extremely concerned? Again, how confident or concerned are you about your organization's ability to recover from a ransomware attack?
Okay. It's about half and half between somewhat confident, somewhat concerned, which in most cases, you're probably confident to the point of I can get some of my environment back online, where that's that middle ground in most cases, where about 20% of the respondents were extremely concerned for bringing their environment back online, which is typical for a lot of customers that we talk to, because you don't think about the recovery scenario for how you deliver your solutions themselves. It's a checkbox to have business continuity in a backup solution, but you need to have backups in a recoverable solution. And recovery sometimes is not just having the data available, it's actually being able to deliver that in a timely manner back to the applications. And when you look at what the FBI, Kaspersky, Sophos, all these organizations are now starting to say, backups are a must for every organization that are out there. And that allows you to start to say, well, I need to have this in my environment. I need to be able to deliver a robust solution to keep our business online. And when you look at how often people are actually doing backups, you're doing backups generally on a daily, hourly, depending on the workflow basis. But recovering them to ensure the integrity of the actual data from being infected by ransomware is not typically common, where there's a lot of customers that do DR tests. Sometimes that's delivered by production storage, but you're never really trying to recover from backups because your solution today, unfortunately, doesn't allow you to do that. And that's where you have to start to think, well, what can I do in my environment to start to speed up these types of workflows, to start to speed up how we start to deliver these solutions? And that's pretty simplistic on when you're starting to think, well, is there a better solution out there to deliver these workflows for us? And you're trying to think, is that easy for us to deliver? Is that something that we can easily consume and not have a huge uplift on our current environment to rip and replace literally everything that we have, software, storage, all those types of things that we have? There's a lot of platforms out there that can enable you to do more with less, but there's solutions out there that enable you to do lots of things with a very simplistic approach. And when you start to look at, all right, well, there's polling out there, and the scary thing that you think about here, 66% of companies say it takes upwards of 5 or more days to recover from an attack. This is bringing the data back online, but not even just bringing it back online, it's validating the data is clean from being encrypted again. Because in some cases, when you look at customer deployments that are out there and they've been impacted, there's been times where customers have been impacted and they recover their data and then the attacker is still in the environment and they re-encrypt the data. So there's a lot of concepts to start to think about of, well, I need to ensure that the front of my house is still clean, where the back of my house is bringing the data back online, and I need to validate that the data is still clean after I've brought it back online. And it's even more concerning that 50% of companies say they have not tested their disaster recovery plan in the last 2 months. And we all are working with very limited IT organizations in most cases. The challenge that you start to face is there's no customer that tests a large scale restore in their environment to see how long it would take to bring their environment back online. And in some cases, there's no recovery plan in the case of an attack on the whole environment. And maybe just a handful of applications have a recovery plan. And in some situations, there's no incident recovery or incident response engineers that customers are starting to roll out. That's a newer title from an organization perspective, where they respond to situations like ransomware or other situations from an IT organization perspective. And they enable the business to move mountains, allow them to bring an environment back online in a segmented manner to ensure that the business can be up and running as soon as possible. And then 39% of companies say they have not tested their backup plan ever. And this statistic is pretty startling, because we're in a time that it's no matter of if you're going to be attacked in most situations, it's a matter of when you will be attacked as an organization. And if there's one thing that you could take out of this webinar from a hey, we should go do these 3 things after the fact, it's test your backups, it's test your recovery plan, and it's ensure your speed is justifiable for the organization to make sure that you can bring your environment back online in a very timely manner. Timely being in the sense of it's not going to take you months to bring an environment back online. So with that, I'm going to bring up another poll question.
And so if the answer is never for you, don't worry, you're not alone, because 39% said never. But the question is, how often do you test your disaster recovery readiness today? Is it weekly? Do you do it once a month, once a quarter, once a year? Or have you never tested it yet? So do it for what has been your practice to this point before this presentation, not what you're intending to do after the fact.
39% of the attendees unfortunately responded with never, which is, hey, I mean, hey, that's exactly the number. That's very odd.
Yeah.
That's pretty accurate polling from the vendor that the 39% statistic came from. So now we've revalidated that number. But 31% say about once a year is when you actually do a DR readiness test, and that's common. I mean, in most cases, when we talk to organizations as a business, they do specific workflows, DR tests once a year for a specific thing, but they do them quarterly, they rotate between applications, and that's very common in most cases. The challenge comes into play of, well, if you needed to bring back a larger scale environment, is your environment capable of delivering that? And that's where you as an organization start to need to think about. And when we think about these questions, when you start to look at your new solutions, hopefully out of this webinar, when's the last time you restored a larger amount of data in your environment? And I'm not talking a couple gigs or a couple 100 gigabytes. I'm talking 5 terabytes, 10 terabytes, and not every organization has that much data. But if you had to recover that amount of data, how long would it take you with your current infrastructure from your production storage, your network, your servers, as well as your backup solution? How long would that take you to restore? And if you're using the cloud, how long would that take you to restore from the cloud? And then how long did these take? Record that. How can you improve that? What is your SLA for your recoveries for your mission critical applications? Did I meet that SLA that I agreed upon 5 years ago for that application that we never really had intentions of meeting because we never validated it? That's a huge consideration where you're starting to look at new solutions out there. And where's the bottleneck? All right, well, I need to replace my network, or I need to improve my servers, or I need to improve my production storage, or I need to improve my backup. There's all types of things that customers have to modernize in their environment just to keep up with the Joneses, if you want to call it, just to improve their recovery speed. Because if you don't have a good recovery mechanism and don't resolve bottlenecks to meet your SLAs for those mission critical applications, unfortunately, you may be out of a job in the future because they will find someone else that will do that and allow them to organizationally improve their environment. And as you look at your infrastructure solutions, can you achieve your targeted SLAs with your current solution? In most cases, customers don't have that capability to deliver that, which is what it is. But some customers have the capability of delivering that, and that's all well and good. And we're happy for you to be able to deliver that to keep the business online. So some key solutions concepts. One thing to note, simplicity and reliability of data recovery. That's huge, it's paramount. You want simplicity. You don't want to be buying 5 solutions to deliver certain things. You don't want to be delivering 3 different recovery mechanisms to keep a business online. And you want to have something that's immutable. You want something that has the capability of having either snapshots, air gapping, where it's not something that's on network, it's not something that you can deliver with the solution itself, where it's something that's separated from the overall workflows. And then again, you need to have that speed of recovery. You need to have that rapid restore capability. I need to bring back that database. I need to bring back that virtualization environment as soon as possible. I don't need to be waiting for 3 other processes to happen to bring it back online. And then all the backup vendors have different features that are out there. They all have capabilities to bring live mount solutions that are out there where that reduces your recovery time objective. I can bring it down to 0 because I can spin up that environment back online as soon as possible. And that's all well and good. The challenge is your backup environment capable of delivering that in a large scale workflow? A lot of customers will try it in a, I'm spinning up one singular virtual machine, I'm spinning up one singular database. But if I were to spin up 50 terabytes worth of my environment off of that solution, you may not have a successful live mount capability. And then after the attack, how can I improve it? All right, before I have the simplistic implementation of the solution, I want something that has immutability plus air gapping, so I can protect if they actually get to my production backup storage, I have that air gap copy. And I want something that has that unmatched recovery speed. I want something that does not need to take days to recover a couple terabytes worth of capacity. And then I want to look at my security posture after the fact. How can I reduce the future attacks? Well, that's sometimes having security logging, some analysis of the environment on a regular basis, keeping up to date with your patching. I mean, we all hate doing that type of workflow, but keeping up to date is a huge challenge that customers face because we only have so many hours in the day. And if there's one thing for you to take out of this webinar itself, ransomware is a huge market for attackers. Unfortunately, no organization is immune. And the challenge that you start to face is, how can I improve how I do my business today? And how can I look to add value to an organization to help us proactively avoid ransomware attacks or limit their attack vector to a very limited segment as well.
Fantastic. Well, Lucas, thank you for taking us through all that. We've got a lot of great questions coming in from the audience, and we will continue to take your questions for the remainder of the hour. You can just submit them by entering them into the questions module. So just to start, we have a few questions around the recovery thing, Lucas. So you said it takes around 5+ days to recover on average. How quickly should companies be able to get online after a disaster? What's actually possible? And there was a question from Bruno wanted to know, how can you recover faster from attacks over blockchain platforms in particular?
So the improvement and what's the targeted mechanism on recovery? A lot of that is how long, what's your monetary loss if an application workflow is offline? What does that cost the business? All right, from that aspect, how long is a sustainable cost delivered? If it takes you $20,000 an hour for an application to be offline due to lost productivity of your employees, potential lost productivity of your end users, whether that's business to business or end clients, if that is a longer period of time where it takes up to 5 days, that's a huge amount of dollars from an organization to lose in a dollar perspective. So from that, what can I have as a known loss for the organization that I don't have a huge concern, I don't have a lot of heartburn over, but to bring an environment back online is not an easy task. To bring an environment back online in a very clean manner is not an easy task. But there's a lot of solutions out there that can improve this, and we as an organization can help customers understand that and help customers improve their livelihoods to not have to be concerned about recovery being that forgotten workflow from an organization, because when you look at solutions from us, you may not have that challenge anymore from an organizational perspective. And can you elaborate a little bit more on that blockchain one? Can you reissue it?
Yeah, is it possible to recover faster from attacks over blockchain platforms? It's just, how do you get that faster?
So from a blockchain aspect, that's a little bit of a different workflow for how customers are using blockchain. And if you start to spin up net new environments that have a known good copy of the data, you start to have a beneficial workflow that you can speed up how your environment can be used in a blockchain aspect. Not every organization, unfortunately, can take advantage of blockchain deployments because not every workflow has been modernized to take advantage of that type of aspect. Everyone, unfortunately, we're probably in a world where over 95% of organizations still have database workflows that are the main driver of how an organization is run. And that is how customers need to spin up their environment. And unfortunately, it's a very serial fashion model where you have a web front end, you have an application, and you have a database backend in most cases.
Here's a real interesting live quandary question that Alberto is actually working on right now. He says, my client is a very old organization and depends very little on their servers. They still have backups of everything in external disks. We are redoing their whole enterprise architecture and developing, implementing, and securing the system. And he has two questions. What are my biggest threats at the moment? And then in terms of security and protection against ransomware, how should I start to have a sufficiently good initial security and a great infrastructure foundation so I can grow it efficiently? A lot to process there.
Yeah. So generally speaking, you want to have limited access that administrators can delete things off of platforms. So one of the challenges that we've seen across our install base from customers, when we've seen attacks hit customers, unfortunately, the data either gets encrypted from a front-end perspective, or their whole production storage due to a compromised credential, whether they left it as a default login. Unfortunately, default logins are pretty simplistic to find. You can find those pretty much on an online search. And they deleted the data off of the platform. Trying to restrict that workflow where administrators have no capability of deleting things off the platform is where you need to start. You want to have a zero trust factor where we're all human, we all make mistakes, but you want to have that zero trust factor where the technology limits the capabilities that an administrator has. There is extra mechanisms that you can deliver where, depending on the storage manufacturer, depending on the solution manufacturer, you can have a two-factor authentication workflow that they can come in and potentially improve, potentially delete things if needed, validated that you have a specific workflow where maybe you have a PIN that you give them from a support perspective to enable you to have them come into the box and remove what you need removed to make sure that you are the right person at the organization to do that. And you can have that be a lot of different ways from an organization. And what was the first question that he had? I don't know if I directly answered that.
Yeah, the first one was, what are the biggest threats at the moment, given that environment?
Yeah. So the biggest threat ultimately is the human factor. I mean, still we are the biggest challenge to this because technology will help alleviate probably 75% of the issues. I mean, technology is there. That's why these security manufacturers are so successful in what they do. But there's the human factor. We all make mistakes, and unfortunately, that mistake then fruitions into something that eventually comes into a situation. And trying to keep up to date, trying to modernize your environment where you don't have Windows Server 2003 running applications anymore, trying to make sure that you're up to date on all of your patches for your firewalls. This enables you to make sure that your environment is not going to be susceptible in most cases to an issue, but there's still that human element that we may unfortunately bring in something, and we may unfortunately leave something open, and that enables an attacker to come in. I mean, one thing I didn't talk about during the presentation, but there's ransomware as a service now, which is scary to think. You can go to the dark web and you can go in and just say, hey, I want to pay $5,000 for this business to be attacked, and here are some entry points that we think that are there, and then there's someone that will sign up for it, and then they will just use, call it bot frameworks, to go and try and target that business to try and get in. And that's a huge market these days that you would never think that was there, but that allows them to take a cut of the ransom itself. And this is being all run out of, unfortunately, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, in Asia. That's where a lot of these people are being done. But the challenge also is it's very simplistic on writing this code nowadays, because it's not super challenging on delivering a mechanism to get into a customer's environment, just because of not every customer is really keeping up to date.
So you talked about the value of protection in depth and really taking a multifaceted approach. So I'm going to sort of combine a few different questions here. So Rachel, this is an interesting question. Rachel asks, can't software be built to prevent ransomware in the first place? And then Evaristo wanted you to go into a little bit more depth about the architecture of the information. You know, what do you do to take into consideration ransomware attacks when you're actually architecting the information? And then the third thing that I think, you know, we just bring in from your presentation is, you know, you talked about the importance of backup, but can you prevent hackers from corrupting backups themselves? So there's a lot in there, but I think given, you know, that protection in depth, I think that's sort of makes
Yeah.
sense.
So from a software perspective, if you were to say, hey, can I make software immutable by nature in the sense that it will not be corruptible, it won't be attackable, the challenge comes into play of your software is only as good as the operating system it potentially is being run on, because the operating system is usually the attack vector that they're looking at, because the file systems that are in play on those platforms, Windows, Linux, or even other platforms that are out there, they have easier ways to get in, and unfortunately they have mechanisms to inflict harm on that actual application, because they can go in and talk to the underlying storage system that's applied to that application, and that's usually where the data is being impacted. It's not directly at the application level, although some applications can be impacted depending on how they're written, depending on how they're accessed. But that's a huge aspect of how that environment happens. And from a backup perspective, keeping an immutable copy of it, a lot of platforms out there nowadays have that capability of delivering immutable copies. And what immutable means is I have a piece of data that I've written down to a storage target, and it's actually not editable after it's been written down. So that allows you to know that you have a known good copy, because it cannot be changed after it's been written down. Now, someone can come in and encrypt the production storage, and then you take a net new backup, and then you have a net new backup data set that has that encrypted workflow in it, but you still have that immutable copy that was originally there, unless you've purged that off just due to your data retention from a backup perspective. So there's a lot of things that you have to consider of how can I protect my production storage, how can I protect my backup storage, and what is the best mechanism to deliver that. It's restricting administration access, restricting the capability of it's using that immutable capability that platforms nowadays have that allow you to have a better mechanism to protect your data sets themselves. Unfortunately, it doesn't protect data exfiltration. The only ways to protect data exfiltration is to have good solutions on the security endpoints that allow you to make sure that data can't be taken out of the environment on a solution that isn't meant for the data to be taken out on.
Great. Well, and I think you may have answered most of Boyan's question, but I'm going to ask it anyway and see if there's anything else you would add to it. He says sometimes bad backup procedures lead to backing up bad or corrupted or inaccurate data. Do you have any suggestions for improving this?
So there's some solutions that are out there that are starting to take into account like anomaly detection. So there's a lot of backup software that starts to use machine learning technology that they can detect if there's a certain quantity of files that have changed in a backup segment based off of the historicals that have happened on a backup window. If there is a large increase that has happened between the prior backup and the most recent backup, or even historical last month's backup versus this month's backup, if there's a huge delta and they can detect certain trace markers in that backup, they will flag it for your visualization to go look into it, and then you can say, yep, that is encrypted data, or that's data that has an issue with it, and then you can restore the production data from a known good copy based off of the workflow that most backup software vendors will use for how they are starting to do it. A lot of them are starting to offer the service. Some offer it as a paid-for service. Some of them are offering it as inclusive with their software itself.
And Rajiv is asking, can't the attacker plant a virus that carries over to the backup?
So depending on the aspects of how storage platforms can be accessed, a virus can get written down to the front end storage from a backup perspective. There's no issue with that. The challenge is there's no way to execute that virus on that production storage, depending on what solution you're using. Now, if you just have a Windows server as your backup mechanism, unfortunately, you have a very large attack vector. But if you're using sometimes proprietary built hardware that does not have access to the underlying storage platform on it, you have a smaller attack vector for that virus to actually be impacted in the solution itself. So depending on how your solution is deployed from your organization, you don't have an issue if you have a solution that does not allow access or does not read into the data that's actually been stored on it. That allows you to know that your data is known good, and you don't actually have to worry about a virus being backed up because it's actually not going to be executed on the backup storage in most cases.
Great. So a lot of companies do choose to pay the ransom, and can you talk a little bit about what is the effect of paying the ransom? Does it mean that the attackers will attack the same organization again because they got the payment, and it's a signal that they might get more? Have you seen any data or sort of track record around that?
So some of the big ones that have been out there, even recently, Colonial that you mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, they were all the ones you publicly see most of the time. They've paid a ransom in most cases, just due to the fact of their public image. They need to get the data back as soon as possible. And the quickest mechanism to deliver this is usually paying the ransom, because that allows you to get your data back online as soon as possible. Most of the time, because that key allows you to decrypt your production storage. But when you look at customers that get hit again, it's not as large as you probably think. They may be hit in a different facet. In some cases, they may be hit from I'm just going to use Garmin, for example, because they were a public one last year. Like, they had a specific line of business that got hit. They may have another line of business that gets hit at a different time if they were to ever get hit again. And that potentially would be the same aspect of being hit twice, but it's how large some of these organizations are, it may not impact the business the same way that other ransom impacted the business.
Great, and I think we have time for just about one more question. So Charles is asking, it would seem that the increase in attacks indicates that organizations should conduct penetration tests more often and perhaps change the nature and the structure of their testing. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so penetration tests have been something that customers should be doing for a very long time. I mean, when you look at a lot of organizations that are out there, the human factor, as I've mentioned multiple times, is the issue in most cases, because we all click on links that we shouldn't click on, we open files that we should not open, because we think it's normal, because it was sent to us by an end user that we thought was the right end user, but ultimately it was someone that was masking themselves. And that's what penetration testings are really trying to do. They're trying to attack the human element, but then they're also trying to attack the technology element, where they're trying to see if there's an attack vector that they can get in on a technology segment. If there's that back-end window that you tied into from a software perspective with another vendor, they try and get in that manner. There's all mechanisms to protect yourselves from a front end, and there's lots of ways to protect yourselves from the recovery mechanism, but not all recovery mechanisms are one and the same. Where yes, a lot of security solutions are not one and the same from a front end, but they all generally meet the same needs, where they're trying to protect your end resources from a network perspective, where backup solutions in most cases, you're trying to protect yourselves from getting back online from a recovery perspective, which brings the business online, where if your network's offline in some cases, or they take an application offline from a penetration just due to either like denial of service or something of that nature, that's a different aspect compared to how ransomware attackers are trying to get into environments and inflict pain in a different way in some cases.
I'm going to slip one more really quick question in here. We've got a couple of questions around what's the deal for small businesses, and there's a question also around individuals. Are individuals being targeted for ransomware? And can you talk, are there things that are different, whether you're an individual or a small business, that you can or should be thinking about?
So I would say yes, small businesses are being impacted. I don't know, to a point of individual contributors being impacted. Potentially if they're using public services that are not protecting their data. So if they're using Google or they're using a box or something of that nature from a file share perspective, they need to ensure that their data is protected in that manner because that's their namesake at that point. But you'll see that small organizations are being impacted. I mean, there was a 60 Minutes, which is a TV show in the US on CBS. They did a segment on ransomware. There was a small town in the South that was impacted, and the ransomware attacker said, hey, give us $25,000. And then they actually negotiated down to literally $5,000 because they said, hey, we're a small town organization. We don't have that money that you're talking about. Here's what we can give you, and that's all we can give you. And coincidentally enough, that ransomware attacker was fine with that, but there's no organization that's small or large, unfortunately, that's being impacted. There's a web page online that goes over the size of organization that's been hit, and it's huge. Some of the organizations that have been hit this year, last year, years ago, it seems to have picked up steam in the last 2 years, more than any other year in the past.
Great. Well, we are just about out of time now. So Lucas, thank you so much. Really interesting and so timely a talk. It's in the news every single day, and the examples are scary. I mean, at the beginning of your presentation was like, wow. So and also thank you guys in the audience for your great questions. I wish we had a little bit more time to get through them all. And finally, a final thank you to our sponsor, Pure Storage. This is a critically important topic, and we do appreciate your insight and experience in this area. Thank you so much.